Killer Evidence is a brand new true crime show where shocking UK and US killings got solved through forensic expertise. Each story gets told by the key people involved in the investigation, from the discovery of the crime to the arrest of the guilty. Our guest today is Donal MacIntyre, a criminologist and journalist known for his undercover work and exposés. In Killer Evidence, Mr. MacIntyre talks about the people involved and the process followed, and gives us rich insight into each case.
How are you?
Hi, good, and you?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
First thing, I'd like to thank you for doing this interview. We really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure. Delighted. So here you ask a middle-aged man to come on to you and talk about himself for 15 minutes. Oh, it's like all the dates I've ever had, man.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's good.
Yes, we're very proud of the series, and we're very proud, and we always feel as if we are very much in tune with our audience. And we don't say this in a marketing spiel. For me, I've felt as if I've always grown with my audience. And so I've, as the audience, as I started out as a hardcore investigative reporter, undercover, traditional documentary investigations, and then finally rather than just convicting people legitimately on television for their crimes, I've now kind of expanded with CBS since 2011, my first relationship with them and programs with them. We're sort of expanding and working up with the audience, not just showing the case and expanding the case, but then understanding much more about the victim, the perpetrators, but also why the victims are victims and why the perpetrators are perpetrators. And then the additional level is, the end, perhaps, how can we prevent such crimes like this in future? But I do feel as if my journey into being a criminologist and into the analysis of the how and why of the perpetrator, as much as the how and why of the victim, because sometimes victims, are more likely to be victims of certain crimes than others. But that journey has been shared with the audience. I do think the true crime audience has become, increasingly sophisticated, fueled by, really informative dramas and other and books, and of course the reporting of crime.
Yeah, speaking of which, I found my passion for criminology started when I started watching shows like CSI and Bones. What's your favorite fictional crime-solving show?
Well, that's it. Well, it has to be, and you're probably too young, Columbo. Columbo was always the wonderful thing because you knew the answer before. So you came down, and the principle was you arrived at the crime scene, and he instinctively, you knew, the audience knew who perpetrated the crime. And then it was a battle of wits between, Columbo, the kind of diminutive Italian kind of swagger, but very charming family man who would have a little jacket and would have a dachshund with him and a little wry sense of humor. And just one more question. So his battle of wits to try and overcome this perpetrator who had thought he committed the perfect murder. So it was always, and because you knew the answer at the very start, then it meant that the journey to the solving, that was the crux of it. So, so it should really just be like watching the highlights of a football game you already know the results of, but actually, no, it's much deeper than that. So Columbo has always been, but obviously I would have enjoyed all those CSIs and as you would have done. But I think I always think, as teaching criminology and my fellow professors previously at Birmingham City University, they'd always say to the first year undergraduates, if you think criminology is like CSI, you're so far wrong. And I would always say, well, actually, they're not. I mean, first of all, every CSI laboratory looks like the back room of a pharmacy. It looks dull and boring. The lighting is different. So when we film in and do reconstructions of CSI scenes for this series and others, if we go to legitimate laboratories and do that, we have to relight it because people's expectation of what CSI investigation looks like, it's like space age, but the reality is it's much more banal and benign than that. But I think that criminology students, should be excited. It's absolutely no problem. I think it's important that true crime propels people into the study of criminology, because once you're there, then you're harnessing the minds and expanding their understanding and inquisition into the how and the why of crime. So although you have a captive audience into criminology with CSI, you kind of move and everybody evolves, particularly over the course of a 3-year degree.
Speaking of those fictional shows, What's your biggest pet peeve of inaccuracies that they do when you watch it?
Well, I always, a very good question. Well, I'm always irritated at their depiction of photographers. I went undercover as a photographer myself in the world of fashion. And so I took a half-day lesson with a guy called Andy Lane in London. And then within 6 months, I was able to blag my way in as a photographer backstage with Naomi Campbell, Kate Moss, with some of the leading men in Elite, and eventually became a judge in a high-profile competition, all in the back of being able to talk and spoof about photography and look like I've taken photography and attending and taking photographs at high-end fashion shows like Versace, such as. And when I see these programs, they have these photographers clicking like this, right? And even now they have, these exaggerated sounds and I'm thinking, man, can you not just teach even teaching the paparazzi photographer how to look like you're taking a photograph? I mean, it's like, it's nonsense. So when I watch those programs, and it's a very good question, that's the one thing, honestly, because I have lived that life as the actor playing that role, but I played it for real. So yeah, it was the depiction of paparazzi or photographers that always annoys me. Yeah, good question. Yeah. I haven't really ever been asked that question before, but thank you. I feel better now having got that out of my system.
It's important, yes. For Killer Evidence, I listened to an interview you did not too long ago, and you said it was about celebrating the good work that forensic teams do. Now, what is it about forensic teams that you admire?
Well, I think I could, working in television as we do, right? I'm an arrowhead for a whole army of people who are talented and brilliant, and I try to be the best behaved on set as I can be, because I acknowledge a couple of things. One is that their job is to make me look good, and their job is I'm representing the best of their work. And in a criminal investigation, if you're a prosecutor in the States or in the UK, if you're a senior investigating officer, a CP, or a Crown prosecution lawyer, you're representing all the good work of everybody, just like I am as a presenter and reporter. And so I recognize that, and I have the humility and good grace to recognize that I am but a small cog in a big wheel, but I'm front of house. And so being front of house, I really recognize in my own profession, as I recognize in the profession I report on, the quality of the work of those behind the scenes. And the CSI, the technology and the quality of the lab work and the ingenuity and the scientists and the CSI first response don't get the credit they deserve. So we worked hard to kind of take this as an opportunity. One, I think, with a very great title. This is a title which is talking about the absolute imperative of CSI and forensic evidence in the solving of murders, in the catching of killers, and hence killer evidence. And I felt that this was a real opportunity to support and to celebrate the first responders, to demonstrate that without their good work and dedication and ingenuity, that these crimes may not have been solved. But the ingenuity about that, it's not just about the scientific skills and ingenuity. Sometimes it's about having the power of personality and character to bully their way through saying, we need money spent on this. And they say, well, we've only got 100 grand. Well, we need 3 million. No, you can't have 3 million because if you fail that, we don't have any money for that. So it's about the allocation of resources toward those avenues which will produce the best results. So often it is not just the science, the quality of that, the ingenuity, but it's also the personality. And it's about, often it's the collaborative effort between the investigating officers, which we've seen in this series, with the CSI first responders, which basically generate the results. If there is disharmony, if somebody's lazy, if somebody doesn't look after the evidence, somebody breaks the chain of evidence, then all that quality and that good work can be undone. So it really is reflecting on the back of house and to celebrate them, because they're not out. The forensic team is not out there celebrating with the family of the victims, with the SIO and the CPS outside the courtroom of the Old Bailey. They're back working on another case. So I think that was my motivation. And I think we, in our own professions and in any profession, we all recognize that. And so that was part of our motivation. And we worked hard with the production company and CBS Justice to pick out those cases where we felt would, over a span of a decade or two would illustrate that work, where that ingenuity and skill set and the dedication and the extra mile. And many of those forensic officers, they're pursuing that extra mile on their own time and sometimes on their own dime. So chapeau to them.
You've said you've worked undercover and you've obviously met many different people, some a lot less nice than others, doing this sort of thing for CBS. You are exposed to the worst sides of humanity. How do you prevent yourself from losing faith in people? Because I know a lot of people who are much younger than you, haven't experienced anything close to what you have, but they're very negative about people and where we're headed to.
Well, I think every generation will say that, the next generation is the worst. I think we are living kind of difficult times. I mean, the reality here is that outside of South Africa, in the UK and Europe, is the crime rate has dropped. And the murder rate has dropped by, 2/3 in the UK. And there are interesting reasons for that. Some people would say, well, most criminals are active it's testosterone driven, and they're mostly male, and they kind of more or less hang up their gloves by the age of 30. So it's 18 to 30 is where most crime is committed, and it's testosterone adult male issue. And the crime rate dropped in the US randomly for a slight segue with the removal of lead paint on the walls, with the expansion of video games, because when they're playing the video games, they're not killing each other at that age. So all these various things, and so they're reducing in the crime rate. So I think you've got to believe in the best of people. There are people who are just irredeemably nasty and bad. I have met killers who are very charming and wonderful and are incredibly loyal and friendly and are the best people you can be to their own tribe, their own family, but actually, would literally kill someone else outside of that tribe because they don't regard them as in their level or human. They regard anybody else as a subhuman. So I've seen people like that. And so most people, even very serious criminals, will have a redeeming quality. Here's the other point: that is everybody capable of murder? And I think maybe that is the case given the right circumstances. I think everybody probably is capable of one murder given the right circumstances, alcohol, probably. But I think some of the murderers here, so probably everyone's capable of manslaughter, losing it in an instant. But I think murder is a different game. So I think there are reasons to be hopeful. I think the crime rate is coming down. I think, by and large, I think it is difficult. It's difficult and different in South Africa, where there is a desensitization of crime, where there is always a nervousness. I think a pathologist in the Three Rivers crematorium who I met before, she talked about this bubbling cauldron. There was always a threat. Even in the wealthiest areas of Cape Town, for example, and 3,500 bodies coming into the Three Rivers crematorium every year, stab wounds, just any number of huge amount of domestics, and it's very, very difficult. And we know the heritage for that. And so how do you solve it? And then, there's a huge proliferation of guns there, proliferation of cheap guns. And so in South Africa, I think it's slightly different. And I was talking to another journalist, and it wasn't on air, but I had said to her, what is the appetite for true crime in a society where true crime, you're living with it over your shoulder, and where the murder rate is quite profound, and not the highest in the world, but a lot higher than it should be. Because there's, across the world, the true crime audience is immersed in this battle to understand, explore, and it's a visceral quality. It's still the other. It's someone else's experience. In South Africa, somebody's always touched by crime or serious crime. And so there's an imperative there to understand the how and the why of crime, and there's a visceral quality, but it's no longer the other. And I'd imagine some people would struggle with the prospect of looking at shows when they've lived the show themselves, in part. But I think there's still a great appetite, and the impetus for a show like this is to understand more about crime and the perpetrators, and also to give some hope that actually in more stable circumstances, CSI is increasingly making murder a very difficult crime to get away with. like nearly impossible. The only way you get away with crime these days is that stranger danger, if it's random, and if in the absence of, and if that perpetrator has not been investigated, been caught up in the criminal justice system before, and if they're willing to commit murder, then they likely would have done, so they're going to be caught with DNA, or there's CCTV and digital tracking. It is so expansive that if you throw the resources at more or less every murder, right, I'm talking millions of pounds, you'll catch it, right? There are some murders, and we've had the Maddie McCann case, disappearances, which are so random and rare, and the circumstances so bizarre. You have a crime scene across all of Europe that is kind of difficult to solve. But most murders in Europe are solved. I know the murder rate in South Africa, the conviction rate is around 25%, so it's quite low. But that's a matter of resources as well. So I think it's fascinating for South Africans. But I think these are shows we offer hope, because most murders, with resources are solved, but also the how and the why of why people commit crimes, and even the how and the why of a lot of murders are, of course, crimes of intimate homicide. They are, the victim. And I think people understand that, either husband or wife or business partner. So in that respect, I'd like to think that, even for those who've been victims of crime, that we can offer something to elevate them, and rather than re-traumatize.
One element of solving crimes especially is the bystanders, the people involved, the witnesses. Like in the first episode, you had that poor guy who found the body in the trash bag, What can I do as a citizen of any country to help reduce the amount of murders that happen in a country?
Well, I think that's very interesting. Well, I think the bystander effect is very interesting, but the bystander itself, first of all, witnesses are often really crucial, but also hugely unreliable. And the more traumatic the incident, the more unreliable the testimony is, because it's like jumping out of an airplane and parachuting for the very first time. Your synapses are so out of sync. It's so difficult, and it's very hard for people to accurately respond to key details. Then get the broad brush right, the key details. If you have 10 people watching the same incident, they will describe literally 10 different scenarios. And some of those who are more willing to help as witnesses, who are a little bit older, studies have shown, are more willing to add in extra details to help prosecute and convict. They add in details, and they're not because they're trying to lie or they're bad people, just because this is our eyes and our brains are filling in gaps that we don't solve. And subconsciously, some people are, even with the more horrific and visceral it is. But I think, the key points: drink and serve less alcohol. I think supporting for the victims of domestic violence, if you want to make a most important thing, early intervention in issues of domestic violence, support, and alcohol and guns. So 3 issues. Is that domestic violence, most of the murders, a huge amount of murders in South Africa, of course, are domestically violent. Murders which assaults generate to murder when there are guns available, and alcohol, And I think that mixture of, sunshine, guns, alcohol, and domestic abuse. And of course, domestic abuse is also a function of, patriarchal society and of socioeconomic issues, etc. So it's a wider issue, but very quickly, gun ownership, support for domestic violence victims, and a kind of management of alcohol and education around alcohol, because obviously alcohol sales and alcohol domestic violence, which leads to murder. But to my mind, in a very ABC 5-minute kind of suggestion, that would be my quick draw on that.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much for your time. This is a great interview. Thanks.
No, pleasure. Great. And have a great day. No worries.
That was special guest Donal MacIntyre talking about the new show Killer Evidence. You can watch Killer Evidence Mondays to Fridays at 9 p.m. on CBS Justice, StarSat channel 222. If you enjoyed this content, please be sure to follow our Facebook page @StarSatSA to stay up to date with our latest content and interviews. I am Hendrik Harmse, interviewing from Midrand, South Africa. Thank you very much and goodbye.